All right, Romans chapter 1. I got told the theme today was on gospel clarity, and I thought straight away, where do you go for the gospel? Of course, you go to Romans. I'm not going to do all 16 chapters. That's not what I meant when I said I had a lot of content to give you. I'm going to focus especially on chapter 1 with references to other parts, and I'm going to wind up in chapter 1, verse 16. So I'm going to end at the beginning, which is kind of counterintuitive, but not really, because actually the beginning is Paul's thesis. So he makes his thesis and then he spends 16 chapters proving it. And so it actually makes sense that we would end there because that's the whole point of the letter. That's what he's trying to prove. But Romans chapter 1, I'm sorry, I didn't inquire what version you use. But again, speaker's prerogative. I'll just use whichever one I like. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. This is a challenging chapter to read, okay? I hope you didn't come here for positive messages just yet. It's coming, but first of all, we're going to get some negatives out of the way. But Romans chapter 1, verse 16, it reads this. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man, or the just man, shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God has made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and of four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie." So it's interesting, actually, the Greek is for the lie, the truth for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. That's the lie, worship and service of creature rather than Creator. For this reason God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things that are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they knew the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they give hearty approval to those who practice them. Let's go back to the beginning and read again. "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." In other words, to everybody, Jews and Gentiles, the whole lot. "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the just shall live by faith." Okay. There is a phenomenon which C.S. Lewis described as chronological snobbery. It is the idea that we know stuff, but they didn't, they being all the people in the past. And it's something, I think, which creeps up on us, that the modern world is the most enlightened, it is the most intelligent, it is the most advanced in all ways that matter, and we today are just completely different, by virtue of how good we are and how much we know and all those sorts of things. And the past was darker, more ignorant, less advanced, less decent. I didn't realize I had actually imbibed that idea until about the age of 19 or 20. I read St. Augustine's City of God. Now, St. Augustine wrote City of God in the sort of 400 AD sort of range of time. And I didn't know what it was as I read that book, but something was going on in my brain. I was really struggling with it. And I realized after about this number of volumes, but after a significant portion, I realized what one of my struggles was. This man was too smart. This was too incredible. It was too insightful. It was too wise. It was too scientific. It was too brilliant because it was old, really, really old. And see, that was a great revelation that I had, namely, that so often what is new is actually very old. He said things there that would leave for dead people who I hear philosophizing and talking about science today. Such incredible insights, even without the technology that we have in this day and age. It's a biblical statement, that there is nothing new under the sun. Human nature basically doesn't change. The way humans organize themselves into societies and the sorts of things they get up to basically doesn't change. It gets weaponized and progressed through technology and so on, but at its root, at its core, it basically doesn't change. And that's important for us to realize because the Apostle Paul has written this book called Romans, and he's just spent chapter 1 describing a society. And you think, yes, a very ancient, a very pagan society, an ignorant society, a society of the past, a society that has nothing to do with us today, of course. Well, like I said, what is new is so often what is old. Let me describe some aspects of that society to you and some things that you might be aware of. I think many of us know that one of the things that happened in ancient Rome, because it was of particular concern to the Christians, was that there was this practice that took place where babies, infants, who were born alive to parents who didn't want them, were left out on city rubbish dumps and in various places to die of exposure. Why would that be? Well, there's a lot of sexual promiscuity in ancient Rome. Perhaps there were children born without complete families. Perhaps there were children born to people who were young and not married. But also there was the problem of lifestyle. Same sorts of considerations we have today. The problem that children cramp your lifestyle, that you might not be ready. Socioeconomic reasons, as they say. And so this practice was widespread, and we say, yeah, barbarous, shocking, dear, dear, dear. Do you know, it wasn't that long ago, at the end of last year, that here in Sydney, in your parliament for the state of New South Wales, they voted through a bill to allow children to be killed in the womb right up to the moment of birth for pretty much any reason. Now, we have the technology to get in a little earlier, don't we? But it's not that different. And amendments were put up to that bill for several things. One amendment was put up to say, well, if a baby is born alive and it's living, it should be law that doctors must render medical care to that child, because there have been dozens of cases of babies born alive and left to die because they're unwanted, here in Australia. That amendment was voted down. Never got through. Another amendment was put up to say, well, okay, babies who are at a sufficient gestational age that they can feel the pain of being torn apart in the womb and having their arms ripped off and their legs ripped off and sucked out, who can feel it. Well, they should be saved. We shouldn't kill those. That also got voted down and never got up. Or there was another one that said, well, a baby should not be killed in the womb just because it's a girl. Got voted down, never got up. And when that bill passed, when all those amendments were voted down, they cheered and they clapped and they celebrated. And a whole bunch of those politicians in our parliament went and had a champagne party that night because of what they'd done. I was listening to Robbie Katter, a Queensland MP, who is in the Queensland Parliament, where a very similar bill passed recently. And he said he had never seen celebration like it. He said they were delighted. They were so happy about what they had done. Do you know, there is nothing about us in that respect that makes us better than ancient Rome. Nothing. Or indeed, you could turn to the way people lived out their sexuality in ancient Rome. Do you know, Rome was a very sexualized society. It was a society where we saw many of the things we see today, and not all societies have gone this way, but homosexuality, pederasty, androgyny, eunuchs, much more besides. And there was a lot of it in society. It was kind of, people turned their nose up, but it was there. But it was also associated with temple worship and the highest and the most sacred places. It was something that sort of had that elevated status in certain parts of the society. It was a society in which I believe the only same-sex marriages were recorded outside of modern Western history. Nero married 2 underage boys. He called one his husband and he called one his wife. He also kicked his pregnant wife to death before that, I believe. Do you know, we live in a time when the same is happening. It always struck me, Ryan mentioned before about the same-sex marriage debate. The first thing a newspaper would say about any new politician or any new leader was what their opinion was on same-sex marriage. Malcolm Turnbull's become Prime Minister. He's a supporter of same-sex marriage, first sentence. And you go, okay, well, that's interesting, but why is it always the most important thing? Because it is kind of the most important thing. And one of the things you'll find as a Christian is that people will test you on that issue very quickly. They'll find out, where do you stand in relation to the rainbow? You know, that pride, that kind of thing. And you know, even the people that serve me in the petrol station have the little rainbow on their badge. It's kind of got this elevated status. And it's kind of all around us. And you know, this sort of thing doesn't do the human any good. You know, I talked about androgyny, the whole ambiguous gender thing, and various bits that go along with that. I never forget, and I tell this story often, we had Walt Heyer come out to Australia. Walt was one of the first ever gender reassignment patients in the modern West. In the late 1950s, I believe it was, he had gender reassignment surgery to live as a woman because he had gender dysphoria and he didn't feel like a man. But of course, he makes the point, if I didn't feel like a man when I was a man, how was I going to feel like a woman when I wasn't a woman and I was just mutilated to look like a woman? But he went through that process. He was alcoholic, depressed, and all the rest of it. Anyway, he realized after a number of years that this was not solving his problems. And so he, to the extent that you can, and a lot of this is irreversible, became a man again, although he was always a man. I mean, we have XY chromosomes in every cell of our body. Okay, you can't actually, I mean, I trust everyone here knows that. You can't actually change your gender. It's just it's a cosmetic thing and some hormones. And when they say in the papers, pregnant man, it's a biological woman. There's never been a pregnant biological man. It doesn't work that way until they do womb transplants and things like that, which haven't happened yet. Praise God. But Walt Heyer tells the story how that he detransitioned, right? And now he's given the rest of his life to running a ministry called Transgender Regret. And he really travels the world, not now probably with COVID, but he spends most of his time in America, where he talks to people who have gone down the same pathway and have regretted the decision or regretted what's happened to them. Many of them never really made a choice. It was all sort of put upon them. And he said he gets calls and he gets emails from people anywhere within 2 days and 9 days of surgery saying, I've done the wrong thing, I think I've ruined my life. And he goes to see them and he always finds out what went wrong. And this is a really widespread phenomenon. And this is Walt's world before this big tsunami is taking place at the moment with all of this stuff. And he says, what went wrong? And he said, in more than 50% of cases, the answer will come back, I was sexually abused as a child. And that was never investigated. That was never solved. That was never dealt with. Do you know how cruel that is? To say to somebody, oh, so you have... I mean, I have known someone who was sexually abused as a child. I have lived in the same house as someone who was sexually abused as a child. It destroys people. And they need help. They need psychological care. But in the world in which we live, in which we're all little gods and we get to say what we are, they say, no, put this person on hormones, put this person on puberty blockers, put this child on these things and give them surgery. And we find ourselves in a position where Walt said, all of these problems get swept under the carpet and the suicide rate is through the roof. Of course, they blame Christians for the suicide rate because we say things like this, that it's not a good idea. No, I think there just might be something else going on. There just might be something else going on. You know, Walt, I said to him, well, why is it that, you seem to be one of the few people who's actually out there doing this kind of thing? And he said, Martin, I'm 80 years old. I said, yeah, so what? He said, the truth is most people who go through this, it causes them so much destruction. It does so much to their psychology. It's such a difficult thing. He said, it takes years and years and years to get over it and to be strong enough to speak. And I noticed when we took him places to speak, he would get up and he'd tell his story, and he would have to go out the back by himself for some time afterwards, and he would actually weep in the corner at the age of 80. This is what it's doing to people. It destroyed people then. It's destroying people now. Ancient Rome wasn't that different in so many respects. You know, it was an ancient Roman poet who coined the idiom bread and circuses. The ANZ Stadium over at Olympic Park, 83,500 people fit in that thing. The Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, wrong one, the Circus Maximus, over 150,000 people. Chariot races, live animal shows, all this kind of stuff. We're the same. And they filled themselves with entertainment and frittered away their time whilst the empire collapsed. It's actually what happened. Bread and circuses. That's all that really mattered. Feed people's appetites. Feed people's distractions. I fear there's something similar going on today. Public expressions of Christianity in ancient Rome were dissident acts. Christians were held in significant suspicion by the ancient Roman community. Part of that was because they didn't participate in society in the same way as most. Because in ancient Rome, so much of society was anchored and tethered to temple worship. It was connected to what was going on in the pagan temples and the rituals there, and Christians didn't have any part in that. And so they became outsiders, they became sort of fringy, and suspicions grew. And there were all these rumours that circulated about what Christians actually believed and what they actually did in their services. And there was actually rumours that they were cannibals, and they ate human blood, because of course the Lord's Supper, the ritual of drinking the wine and eating the bread, and the way the Bible describes that as drinking my blood, and it all got out of hand. And there's various rumours like that. Also that they were dreadfully promiscuous and they had these orgies and all the rest of it for different reasons. And I sit there and I think, yeah, it's interesting. We're dealing today with this problem where, I live in the ACT in Canberra at the moment, and we just recently had this conversion therapies bill pass. And here's the incredible thing. There's no conversion therapy happening in Australia today. And the crazy thing is that they doggedly push it through because these bigots out there will do these things to people. We don't do it to people. We never have done it to people. The thing about Australia is that to the extent that some of those practices existed, they existed as part of mainstream psychological practice. This was not a Christian issue. There's no evidence that this is taking place in Australia. They've got 15 stories, testimonials in this report. And they're people who say, I went to church and they sort of preached that the right way to live was to be married with in a heterosexual relationship, and I didn't like that much, and I think that's kind of like conversion therapy. That's not conversion therapy. Do you know what? Conversion therapy is not even a Christian phrase. I've been in conservative churches all my life. I've never heard it before until an activist said it to me, and I went, huh? Conversion and therapy, not the same thing. Conversion is what God does to you. Therapy is what we do to each other. They kind of don't belong together. There's no such thing. You made that up. But no, you get society, right? And the conversion therapies bill goes up, oh yes, well we've got to stop that because I saw a movie about it with Nicole Kidman. We're in a situation where, and the belief, and I encounter this a lot in the media when I do media interviews, and you sit down in front of people. I remember one in particular, I won't give out too much information, but this person who was interviewing me, by the end of the interview, she was so angry. She was so angry. I thought she was going to get up and hit me in the face. And we finished this interview. It was quite long, actually. And the tension was such that I walked outside with my press secretary, and the two of us got to the door, and we looked at each other, and without saying a word, we just started to run. She was that mad. And I thought about it, why was she so angry? And I know now, looking back and listening to the tape, she was so angry because she was convinced that there was something really, 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 really nasty in here that she had to bring out. And she thought she failed. But it wasn't there. She didn't get what she wanted. Not because I was so expert at hiding. I answered every question she put to me. I even answered the really hard questions that she put to me, but she wasn't happy with those answers. She thought there must be more. I must expose him. She was convinced It was the same in ancient Rome. Christians were held with great suspicion. And it was easy for Nero to blame the fire of Rome on the Christians, these fringy types who we don't really like. It's their fault. People look at me now and they say, you're playing the victim. No, I'm not. I'm just explaining how things are. None of us are victims, that's for sure. But I'm just explaining how things are, the kind of move that's going on in culture. We started the Human Rights Law Alliance at ACL, which is a law firm. And so much of the cases we get, whether it's the foster parents who get called in or become our clients because the foster system has kicked them out because their Christian faith isn't safe for children, or whether it's the small business owner who just was talking to a client about his faith one day and she decided to sue him, and in some crazy interpretation of the law in Western Australia, he winds up at a tribunal in WA, or whether it's the doctor down in Melbourne who wrote on the internet about his conservative beliefs and his Christian principles, and the medical board decides to launch an investigation into him without his knowledge and then rings him up one day and says, your practicing certificate's finished, you're done, mate, pack up and go home. And now he hasn't worked since August last year. He's no longer a doctor and he can't get a job. That sort of thing is not that uncommon. Well, when I say not that uncommon, I mean we have quite a lot of cases, actually, quite a lot of cases. That sort of thing's happening more and more. No place for these beliefs. It's really some of these beliefs that rub up against mainstream society. So I say all that to make this point. There is nothing new under the sun. And there's so much trouble that comes from all the things that I described today. And there was so much trouble then. And it's kind of tragic, because one of the things we learn from looking at society and looking at the way these things unfold is that we learn something which the Bible tells us. And one of the things I want to try to remember to keep coming back to as I speak is just to show you how unbelievably practical Scripture is and how insightful it is. It tells us, for example, that men and women, human beings, are so great, made in the image and likeness of God. Very unique, specific creation, different. And you look at ancient Rome, look at what that society achieved while it existed. Look at the builders of aqueducts, the pavers of great highways, the incredible military strategists, the fabulous sculptors and artists, the heritage of civil law and of engineering that came out of ancient Rome, the creators of haute cuisine, as we'd say, and fine dining, fine fashion, builders of institutions, builders of societies. So great. And yet at exactly the same time, almost in direct contradiction, so wicked. Full of immorality. People are basically full of self, full of self-interest, grasping after self. People are dishonest. I work in politics. I've got to tell you, oh my goodness. Nobody looks you in the eye and tells you what they really think. Nobody. It's this constant game of just playing around with everybody and, trying to outfox them and outsmart them and say just enough but not too much and put him in his place and keep him okay and navigate your way through. What for? Self-interest, pragmatism, getting to the other side. All your relationships are transactional. All your relationships are not real. And it's deceit. The number of times you're just in a conversation going, mate, I know you're lying. What are you doing? And it just goes on and on and on. But it doesn't matter even if you call it out. They will double down and continue, you mark my words. That's politics. I tell you, there's just a bit of that in all of us. There is. We don't expose the truth about ourselves. We basically say and we do what's needed for self, for number one. We are so flawed. We are so unbelievably flawed. So great, so wicked. Isn't that the paradox of the human race? I mean, what was it about Germany? Read Bonhoeffer's biography by Eric Metaxas sometime. Find out what Germany was. Oh my goodness, what a society. There hadn't been greater. It was so cultured. It was so wealthy. It was a bastion of engineering, a bastion of art, culture and all sorts. It was just incredible. Oh, and then Hitler comes along. What was that? And then the whole society is suddenly doing medical experiments on people. They're shooting Jews and gassing them. Where did that come from? So great. So wicked at the same time. Isn't that remarkable? That is the tragedy of the human race. What's changed? Nothing. Nothing. Now, does it carry a little more poignancy? Is it a little more... You think of the Apostle Paul living in his day and seeing all of this. And actually, Paul's a past that. We often read his letters and we read particularly like Romans 1 and we think, oh, that's edgy. Actually, a lot of the things he's saying is because he cares. And you see that very much in 2 Corinthians. His concern, his care, his compassion, that's why he speaks the truth. He's about people. And the Apostle Paul sees this, and he sees the destruction, and he sees the blindness, and he sees the trouble. And he says, you can see him throwing his hands up and go, what's to be done? Well, I think he knows the answer, because he says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God. Of course, that's what he needs for salvation, to everyone who believes, the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, he says, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. The righteousness of God. Can I just ask a question? No, I won't ask a question. I'll just make a statement. I don't need to ask questions. Here's the thing. If you went up to the average, even Australian Christian today, and you said, could you just define the gospel for me? Who would say that? Oh, well, the gospel's the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, for the just shall live by faith. It's never been said, I don't think, unless someone was smart enough to quote the verse. He doesn't mention Jesus. He doesn't mention love. He just says that. And it doesn't make any sense until you realize what the problem is. You realize what the problem is when you read on and you find out that the great enduring disaster of the human race is unrighteousness. That's the problem. And Paul goes straight to the big thing, straight to the big answer. Yeah, you know what? It took Jesus to come. It took the plan of God to be enacted in time and space and history. Yeah, you know what? It required all of God's character, required infinite mercy, infinite love. It took all of that. But what was the big point? Nothing less than to make men and women righteous before God. Now, that's a miracle. That's a miracle. And Paul says that's why he's not ashamed. He's not ashamed because this is a salvation. It's a mighty, mighty deliverance because that's what's needed. He's not ashamed because it's the power of God, which must have been liberating for a guy like him. It's not up to him. He's got to be faithful, he's got to preach it, and then God's power does the work. I'm glad of that every day, let me tell you. I often think of it. But also, it's a power of God to bring about an unveiling, a revelation of something, which just seems to be the very medicine that we need. Righteousness, a purity, a moral excellence, a standard which is nothing less than that which corresponds to God. This righteousness is God's power to save, revealed in the gospel. Now, I'm going to abort mission right there. I don't want to speak further down that line until a little bit later in the day. Instead, what I want to do is, having made that introduction, having spent some time sketching out the problem, I want to continue to go down that line, and I want to start talking about one of the topics which is in the program, which is society. And we've already started to touch on it, as you can see, but I want to make it contemporary. I want to talk a lot about how does this gospel, this lens of the righteousness of God, what does it teach us about society? It teaches us a few things, and this will be a lot of fun because a lot of it is finger pointing at other people, right? Don't worry, we'll get to the tough stuff. That is, and by the way, let me make this point. I was flippant there. I don't mean to be. Whenever we talk about this sort of thing, one of the things the Christian knows, and I think a lot of people in the world at large don't realize this, whenever a Christian says, that's sin, that's wrong, when we mount these sorts of critiques, when we try and explain to people what's good, the Christian actually knows that it's not a pointing the finger, it's not an arrogance. There is an acute awareness in the mind of every Christian that we're complicit in all of this. The same things we see in the world are simply it's just the blossoming of the rotten seeds in our own hearts. And we're aware that but for the grace of God, which is at work in us, that's us. And we know of our complicity. So there's never a high-handedness and an arrogance in a true Christian's approach to culture, to society. I do worry sometimes, working in the political sphere, that a lot of that creeps in. It's why I try not to be too polemical. The last couple of days I have said a couple of polemical things, but on the whole I'm not. And the reason I do that is I don't want to psych people up to feel like, people are the enemy to be destroyed, because that's not a gospel view of people. That's a political view of people. Actually, everybody is a soul to be saved. Changes everything, just like you and me. It changes your outlook, it changes your lens. So it's important to say that. But anyway, the Apostle Paul starts to talk about society by saying this. He says, the wrath of God is, and this is chapter 1, before he brings it into the person's individual heart in chapter 3. But he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And straight away, he goes to the heart of the matter, and I think this is more significant than many of us realize. He points something out. What is wrong with the world? What is wrong with the world of which we've been speaking? What's the problem? There's a lot of answers to that question. And yet the Apostle Paul picks the answer. He says, do you know what it is? He says, well, it's a spiritual sickness. That's what's wrong with the world. The unrighteousness of which we have been speaking stems from a greater problem, ungodliness. It's a spiritual problem in the hearts of men and women. It's a diagnosis that's critically important. And it's essential that we understand that problem, because when we understand that problem, we know the solution. Notice the order, ungodliness and unrighteousness. Every detail when the Apostle Paul writes matters. And that order is significant. The one brings about the other. Reject God, you reject his ways. Simple as that. That's basically the issue. God's righteousness is evacuated from our society because we do not acknowledge God as we ought. And the diagnosis is important because when people come to that question, what's wrong with society, they come up with all sorts of answers. And even the circles I move in, there's all sorts of answers. There's a lot of people out there who treat it as if, well, actually what's wrong is that we're rejecting the fundamental tenets of Western culture. I think, well, firstly, it wasn't all good. There were some bits that could have been fixed. But the fundamental tenets, they'll say, good, okay, all right, let's accept that. Well, all right, then what we'll do then is we'll go out and we'll preach the past, and we'll preach political theory, and it will do nothing for the spiritual condition. Well, not nothing. It'll do little for the spiritual condition of men and women. Or people will go out there and say, well, what it is that the world's rejecting logic and reason and sense. Well, we all know that's true. It happens to be a fundamental tenet of most of the ideologies that are shaping the education system. There is no objective truth, so there's no logical dialogue or sense. Of course not. We're all at war for political power. And I say it's the rejection of logic. And so what will we do? Well, we'll go out there and we'll try and educate and teach people about truth and about logic and all of these disembodied concepts. Well, firstly, who says logic is logic without God? And who says it's more important than my feelings? You'll try and preach those things and you'll get nowhere because they say, yeah, you know what? It's not even like, no, I have my truth. It's like, no, that might even be true. I might accept that, but I feel. So, I feel different. And I'd rather follow my feels. It's not going to work. You're not going to get where you need to go. Or is it just stupidity? Are people just dumb? And you meet these people who are just like, oh, everyone's an idiot, and they've got this, kind of arrogance about them, as if everybody's just stupid and no synapsing neurons and the gene pool's just depleted or something. And these kinds of people will go out there and say, you need to educate. And they're always shoving your big, long, academic papers and all this as if reading this will be the solution to everything. I'm like, look, if education was the solution, I actually think it's the problem. One of the amazing things about God and the spiritual condition of the human race is that throughout Scripture there is a continued emphasis on the fact that natural intellect is not that important. Actually, it doesn't matter that much to your spiritual condition. There are people with low IQs and there are people with high IQs. It doesn't make a difference with God. Not many mighty, not many of noble birth are called, right? That's what the Apostle Paul says. And of course, when Jesus came, most of the people who received him weren't smart people. The smart people preferred to pontificate and shove their academic papers around, and they never found the answer. You know, we may answer that question wrongly. The Apostle Paul doesn't answer it wrongly. It's important that we have this singular clarity. It is that men have forgotten God. Men and women have forgotten God. It is ungodliness. The real problem in the world today is a spiritual sickness. And throughout human history, the real problem has been human rebellion against God and his ways. And that's what unrighteousness means. Righteousness is that which is good because it corresponds to God. And if you reject God's goodness, you reject God's righteousness. And that's why it is phrased the way I mentioned: ungodliness first, unrighteousness second. You remember the biblical principle that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we see that by nature the human race pursues often the opposite. They don't seek their wisdom from the fear of God, they seek it from every other source. In fact, a lot of the sort of high-end philosophy for a couple hundred years now has been people trying to come up with a way to hold to truth and rationality when you've got God out of the picture. It doesn't work, unfortunately. And the question arises for us now, and this is what so much of Romans 1 is about: how exactly does this play out? This ungodliness and this unrighteousness. What does it look like in a society when people get together and live this way? For one thing, Paul makes the point. He says this is the ongoing enterprise of people's entire lives. It's how they decide to live. It's how they persevere in living, despite what they ought to know. Now, that's a big claim. It's a big claim, but let me point out what it means. He says in the next phrase, he says, the wrath of God revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And so he's making the point, and this is more evident from the Greek, which is the imperfect tense or whatever they call it. There's continuing, ongoing sort of sense to it. But anyway, basically what it means is that this is something which it's a culture in which people are actively continuing to suppress the truth. You say, well, what truth? Well, the truth about God, his reality, and the truth about righteousness, what's good and what's bad in his sight. And both of these things, asserts Scripture, are self-evident truths which are revealed to the conscience of all people. And they must either be faced or they must be suppressed. And that suppression is a challenge. And people live suppressing it. Paul says that which is known about God is evident to them, or evident within them is another way to put it. Might be referring to the conscience. He says, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through that which has been made, so that they are without excuse. Even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. Have you ever noticed a peculiar thing about the Bible? The Bible never goes to any great lengths to try and prove God's existence. It doesn't do that. That perplexed me for a very long time, and I didn't know why. But you know, it begins with the obvious. The first words of the Bible are, in the beginning, God created. And there's an assumption. The assumption is you know that. You know that there's a God. You know that he created the very world in which you live and move and have your being. You know that it all began with him. I find that a big claim, and yet it is so true, because he says, how obvious is this reality of God's existence? Do you know it's this obvious? In fact, it's even more obvious than this. The building in which we're meeting right now was not the result of an explosion in a builder supply warehouse. It's that obvious. This building, you know, and you look around and you see a lot of the technology that's involved, you see the construction methods, Do you know, this just didn't happen because someone had an idea one day. This is actually a historical collection of, even the sloped floor. All those sorts of things. When you start looking into engineering principles, it's not straightforward. This is the product of time, of ingenuity, of intellect, of a pedigree of construction and engineering principles, of many specialists coming together, technological specialists, construction specialists, air conditioning specialists, lighting specialists. I could go on and on and on. And combining their knowledge in a coordinated and a combined and a practiced and a trained, rehearsed way, and in putting that intellect, which is from usually years of tertiary education, to create this building. We know that. It's obvious. You don't find a building and be like, well, look what the wind created here. It just doesn't work that way. It sounds crazy to say because people have whipped up this great deception that it's different with the natural world. It's not different. How much more are the fingerprints of God on a creation which an infinity of human minds will never, never plumb the depths of? We're insane. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies above his handiwork. Do you know what that psalm reveals to us, as Romans 1 reveals? God means creation to speak. I have a quiet, happy place in Canberra that I go to. It's a mountain that I climb, and you can sit on the edge of this thing. It's one of the best views in Canberra. I've never seen anyone else there, so it's a great secret spot. But I go up there sometimes, and Canberra actually from above looks really nice. Don't get too close and personal. But from above, it looks amazing. And you can look out over the hills, you can look out over the clouds, and often it's cool and crisp all the time. Sometimes there's snow-capped mountains, and I see God. I see God. We live, we move, we exist, we are bathed in, we are clothed in God's glory every day. He means it. It says, it says the heavens declare, and then it says, there is no speech. And then it says, night unto night they pour forth speech. So it's like they're not speaking, but they are. They are. They're testifying of something all the time. And so many of the early scientists, they only investigated creation because they knew who God was. What drives the assumption that creation is rationally intelligible? It's the assumption that it's made by a rationally intelligible God. Isaac Newton was driven by this kind of thinking. Creation tells us about God. And the glory of God, that concept, it's the setting forth, the manifestation of who God is. That's what glory is. I think, I'm going to get my pronunciations wrong, but I think in the Old Testament it's kavod, and in the New Testament it's doxa. And if you combine those two words, you get substance or weight, and you get setting forth. God is holy. What happens when that holiness is set forth and seen? You get so much light in the eyes that you die. That's glory. God is great and above and outside and greater than creation. So what happens when he comes to Mount Sinai and sits on it? There's a big earthquake and things start to, rock. That's glory. You look at creation, what do you see? Power, intellect, care. You see the minutiae and the grandeur all at once. You see something of God. In fact, what you see of God is his eternal power and divine nature. Can I just make a point before I go there? So much of what people try and come up with to explain away what I have just described. By the way, the people who send their lives to this are the most energetic and the most enthused, and many of them are the kind of atheists that is, there is no God and I hate him. There's a lot of that going on in the scientific world. I think it's because they're face to face with it all the time. You've got to double down, you've got to try hard. There is an enterprise of truth suppression here. And the theories they come up with go against their own scientific laws. Entropy, everything tends to chaos. We know that. We know that. You don't get order out of chaos. Doesn't happen. Never did. Laws of thermodynamics. There's things like this that it's so obvious It's so, so clear. Let me give an example before we break and we can come back and pick this up. I just realised what the time is. Am I about time to finish? Ryan doesn't care. We won't consult the rest. Let me give you an example of this, because I appreciate that it's a big claim to make, but here it is, and it's so true when you think about it. I was driving along in the car a while ago. These attributes that creation reveals: eternity, power, and divine nature, right? It's interesting how closely affiliated those attributes are with the quest of the ages. That is the nature of people. They sit back sometimes and occasionally they look up at the stars in the heavens and they go, how did all this happen? And they start asking questions, and you get philosophers. And throughout the history of philosophy, you get these grapplings with these very things. Where did it all begin? Where did the power come from? Who is this divine being or this God or whatever? Those are the questions. You can go back into Greek philosophy. You can look at the origins of the four elements: the wind, the fire, the water, the earth. What were they looking for? They were looking for the fundamental building block of the world. They were looking for something that had power independently. Wind, to an ancient mind, it looks like it might be powerful all by itself. It might have existed forever. It might be the animating principle behind the world. It's all those sorts of discussions. And it comes right up to the modern age. I was driving along in the car and I heard an interview with a scientist who is working on the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland. Those of you who know, it's this great big tunnel under the Swiss mountains, and they're firing particles at each other to find more particles and all the rest of it. And they're interviewing him, and they're saying, what is it that you're looking for? And this guy tried to start describing what it was that they were looking for. And he said, we're looking for this thing. It's called it's called the Higgs boson, the first time he mentioned it. He said, we're looking for this little tiny particle or something. And he said, to describe the something, he said, I would say that it infused the Big Bang with power. It's full of energy. It's got great power. So we're looking for something that carries huge amounts of energy, or that can ignite huge amounts of energy. And he said also we're looking for the thing that kind of existed in those moments before there was something. We're looking for the thing that was there at the beginning. And I'm like, right. And then he actually said, this is exactly how it panned out. He said, yeah, and it's called God particle. I thought, if there isn't a better example than that of just how blind people can be, then I haven't got it. I mean, sure, there is a Higgs boson, but the things they're searching for ultimately is the very thing that they're denying: eternity, power, divine nature. Self-evident, says the Apostle Paul, revealed to the conscience of everybody. We're bathed in this stuff. We really are. And, I've said these sorts of things in groups, and you can see the cranky people in their seats going, looking a little bit sour. They're angry about it. Why? Why do people sit down and say there is no God, and yet they hate God? And yet they hate the people who talk about God? There's something about that, isn't there? There's a denialism that has to continue to be perpetuated and fanned and fueled. And it's full of energy. It's like when I was a kid, you'd grab, I used to swim, we obviously Queensland, grew up, lots of pools. One of the things I used to do is if you got one of these volleyballs that was floating on the surface of the pool and you try to hold it down, pretty hard to do, especially as a kid. You've got to try and keep it under the surface. And if you're not careful, it'll come up and knock you in the chin. And so you've got to put a fair bit of effort into it as you're kicking along and trying to, hold this thing down. And I just feel like so many people live their lives that way. Holding it down. Don't want to face it. What are the two taboos in society? Politics and religion. People don't, I often joke when I check into a hotel, they say, oh, you're here for work? And I say, yeah. They say, what are you here for? I said, oh, politics and religion. Always creates an interesting response. There's an overall apprehension in relation to religion. If you sit down next to someone and you mention Jesus, they'll probably get up and walk away pretty soon, or at least put the shutters up. Why a resistance to engaging with it? Why an uncomfortableness with engaging with it? I used to work in a big law firm up in Brisbane, and one of the things that I really did not understand, I just couldn't get it, was that all my colleagues, working in a law firm, and I'm sorry if some of you do, I don't mean to depress you, but oh man, the most exciting thing that happens in the law firm in a day is that you go over the road and buy sushi. And people talk about it all morning. What are you having for lunch? Where are you going for lunch? Oh, I'm doing some lunch today. Oh, that's all that goes on. And otherwise you're pushing papers around a desk and writing things and reading until you're cross-eyed. And when you're a junior, you don't have a window office, so there's nothing to look at except a beige wall. I'll tell you what. Oh, the Christmas party's coming. It's going to be heaps of fun, guys. It's like, yeah, September, right? Oh, man. And yet people go, and I nearly got sucked into this vacuum, where you give yourself to it. You absolutely throw yourself into it because of the success. Mate, you can be making 7 figures as a partner or a barrister or something. Go, 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 work, 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 work. We have people who slept on the floor some nights because they work so hard. And then it gets to, after all that hard work, after staying in the city all that time, you get to Friday at 4:59 p.m. and boom, out it all comes from the fridge, straight down the neck, drunk as a skunk immediately, and they're like that until Monday morning. And they come in on Monday morning like, I have no idea what I did on the weekend. And so I have this conversation, rinse and repeat. I used to sit there and think, I must be going mad. Why do people live this way? Do you know they'll deny it to their dying day? But I truly believe that people live their lives denying the truth, suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. The serious thoughts are never had. The major conversations are never had. The life is lived too busy, too full of other things, too numbed on other substances. And you know what? I'm going to leave it there on a low note so that we can progress to a high note in the next session. Thank you.